So there you go. It is a wrap. The 2021 season, it is over. And already we are looking forward to 2022. And do you know what? It's been a year of big name breakthroughs, of the waning of some bright lights, and the confirmation of a seemingly unstoppable superstar. But less about me. Over the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to sift through the highs and lows, the winners and losers, pick out our favourite moments, and also cast our eye over next year's Tour de France route and the exciting rebirth of the women's Tour de France. So for the final time this season, cue la musica. Well, hello.
I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Hello. How are you, Pete?
I'm very pissed off.
Oh, I know. But listen.
But I'm ready.
Good. Because we're in the midst of the podcast now. So hello, my name's OJ Borge. Welcome to the latest La Course on Tête podcast for Aérogramme subscribers, made in partnership with our friends at Peloton magazine, who have asked us to welcome 2 new members to their Outside Plus membership family, the team at Cycling Tips and Pink Bike. With me is Jeremy Whittle. Hello, Jeremy.
Hello there, OJ.
Also, from a seemingly coming out of lockdown Australia is Sophie Smith. Hello, Sophie Smith.
Hello, good morning, good evening.
And I didn't think we were going to hear from Peter Cossins due to technical difficulties, but he's just appeared. Hello, Peter Cossins.
Hello, OJ. I've made it at long last.
If we were going to equate your technical problems to a bike rider throwing a bike into a bush, who would you be right now?
I think I'd probably be Michael Rasmussen. I'd be on about my third throw by now.
Yeah, I was thinking more Bradley Wiggins. You know when he thought he was out of sight and he threw that Pinarello into a bush?
I do remember that, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's where we're at. But anyway, after everything that we went through in 2020, what do we all think of the 2021 season? We're here at the fag end of it. Was it a classic one, Jeremy? Will it stay with us?
I think it was a classic, actually, for lots of reasons associated with the quality of the racing, but also because of the circumstances that surrounded what felt like, to me, almost a rebirth and a rediscovery of the joy of watching and getting enthralled in bike racing again. And I think, history will look back on it and think, well, the 2020 season was kind of one of scrambling just to try and sustain it and just to try and retain something. And then 2021 was really memorable for lots of different reasons, because, as you say, big names, new names, innovation, first women's Paris-Roubaix, etc., etc. Lots of stuff that was really enthralling.
Sophie, do you feel that for some reason? I felt like if you were to write down everything that happened in 2021, you'd go, wow, what a season. If you wrote it down, maybe you read about it in the La Course on Tête book, for instance, which is available right now from all good retailers and the La Course on Tête website. You'd go, wow, what a season. Part of me just feels slightly unfulfilled.
Yeah, no, I think the season as a whole, I would agree with Jez that it was a classic season, but I do think there were races. The Tour de France for me this year was one where I found it a little bit overwhelming, not to detract from anyone's results there, like Tadej Pogačar. That would actually be one of my highlights of the season, just the way he approached that race, his general demeanour there. But I know a lot of people said that was a classic tour, for example. For me, it really wasn't when half of your contenders sort of crashed out on stage 3. And for the first time ever, a lot of people I spoke to there then started using it as prep for the Olympics. And the Tour is the one race, as an example, where people say they don't use it as a prep race for something else. But I think on the whole, I would agree with Jez. It was a good season, and you have to take into consideration that we are still in a pandemic, and we had a relatively normal season in spite of that and everything that came along with it. And we also had new riders to focus on. I think there's been a wholesale changing of the guard in the peloton now, and with that, changing in racing and changing in the super teams, as we cover in our La Course anthology this year.
I mean, that's the thing, isn't it, Pete? When you look at it, if you think back to 2020, all we talked about was, will the race happen? When the races started, will they finish? The highs and the lows, the rights and the moral rights and wrongs of actually racing in the midst of a pandemic. 2021, we haven't even mentioned it, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of floated in the background. I mean, there's been a few cases of COVID. We've still got restrictions around the races, and obviously fans aren't really allowed near buses and things like that. But it's felt like a normal season. I mean, pretty much all the races have gone off okay. I mean, certainly in the latter part of the season. And I think it's been really good. I mean, I think I wrote a blog, well, probably at the start of this year, maybe at the end of last year, just talking about a golden generation of riders. And I just think, I mean, Sophie mentioned Pogačar there. I mean, we've got Van Aert, Van der Poel, Julian Alaphilippe. I mean, they've all done astonishing things this year, and we're just kind of seeing more of those phenomenal riders and the way that they ride, spicing up cycling. I think it's been great.
I think the reasons I think it's been a really good season are basically not, as I say, not really to do that much with the quality of the racing. I think the Tour de France was quite a damp squeer, but not boring, but it lost its tension about halfway through because we all knew who was going to win, unless there was some bizarre mishap for Tadej Pogacar. But I think you look at all the stuff that surrounded the year, that, as Pete was saying, that the anxiety about whether races were going to take place or not, that was all gone this year. The Canada ran as normal, but it felt like everybody came to the races with a refreshed appetite for racing and for spectacle as well, and I think that was reflected in the quality of a lot of the racing that we saw.
Absolutely. I think that was the youth of the riders that were taking part. Also, I think a lot of people were riding for their careers, weren't they? People were realising that if they didn't show what they could do now, maybe the future of them as professional bright riders wasn't going to happen, Sophie.
I agree. I mean, Mark Cavendish, you could argue, was a case in point there. At the end of 2020, he was circling the sinkhole of retirement. He was a person that you no longer went to his team bus and asked him where he was, and there was that probably now famous Sporza interview where he sort of just went through the mix zone at Wevelgem, I think it was, in tears because he was just looking at a very lonely exit from the sport, and then has come back.
He retired.
Who?
He retired. We did a whole podcast on it. We did a podcast on Mark Cavendish retiring because he said that was it.
I think he speculated that would have been it because at the time I just don't. He had no offers, and Koenig Quickstep offered him a lifeline. I think that a sponsor reportedly paid for that contract, and he's come back. And obviously there was, I maintain, just he had dumb luck at the Tour and what he did, but and the political circumstances surrounding that and Patrick Lefevre's slander campaign against Sam Bennett, basically. But I mean, to go from a winless 3 years to, whether you like him or not, to what he did at the Tour is a perfect example.
You do make your own luck, don't you, though, in those situations? And he stayed in there. He kept in it. Now, we were going to talk through what were the 3 best moments of the year, but I think, do you know what? Let's look at the high point. Let's look at the high point of the year. Let's each choose our high point of what we thought 2021, cycling-wise, really made it. The sort of thing that you'd tell to your nan who doesn't like cycling, go, Nan, look what happened here. Wasn't this amazing? So, Jeremy, you're good with nans. What was your 2021 moment of the year, cycling-wise?
I had 3 nominees: Strade Bianche, the Giro stage where Danny Martinez yelled at Egan Bernal.
Did he? What did he yell?
He shouted at him, come on, when he looked in danger of losing the race lead. And then the women's Paris-Roubaix. And I've settled finally on the race that I think set out the season stall, which was the finale of Strade Bianche with Mathieu van der Poel, Julian Alaphilippe and Egan Bernal as well in the finale there, because they all went in to achieve great things. They all had kind of mixed seasons with highs and lows, peaks and troughs, but I think the 3 of them were really, aside from Tadej Pogacar, the 3 biggest names of 2021.
What is it then, do you think, about Strade Bianche that we all love so much? Because I love it as well. There is something about it, and it's not a race that really, until a couple of years ago, was on my horizon. I just didn't know that much about it. Now I can't wait to see those white roads, to see the chalk dust coming off the road as they batter through. It always seems to be exciting. It's great racing.
I think everything about it works really well. I mean, it builds really well. You've got the fantastic landscape. You know, we're all suckers for the Tuscan landscape. It looks particularly beautiful in the spring with the cypress trees and the kind of, you know, the low sunlight and spring just on the horizon. And then you've got that fantastic finale as well into Siena, which is obviously, you know, you can't find a more beautiful spot really in Italy to finish a bike race. And it just seems to have drama, and I think it's a really great length as well, because it's some of the classics for me, they're a little bit too long. I mean, we had that conversation, didn't we, at the start of the year on social media about the length of Milan-San Remo. You know, has Milan-San Remo started yet?
Oh, it's boring, San Remo. I think if you're going to get rid of one of the monuments, switch that for Strade Bianche.
Well, you see, Strade Bianche
Rubbish.
Strade Bianche isn't like that, is it? Because you start watching the last 2 hours and you're gripped. You can't move really. You have to sit and watch it because you don't know what's going to happen. And I think I'd agree that San Remo doesn't quite have the same.
Well, yeah,
potential.
you might as well watch the last 1 minute of San Remo. Pete, you disagreed though.
Yeah, I mean, San Remo is just you need another 25 years watching it, OJ, and then you'll get it.
But how is that good? That's like the argument for cricket, isn't it? Going, well, it's been 5 days to get to a draw, but if you know the history of England versus Australia, you know it was a very important
Exactly.
draw.
It just builds. It builds and builds and builds. San Remo. I mean, I did feel like you did for a long time, but it's really grown on me, that race. And I don't know, but there's just so much symbolism to it. It's not just about what you're seeing on the road. There's all kinds of things going on. I mean, Jeremy's talking about the low light of spring and whatever. I mean, San Remo is just like it's the race that takes cycling from winter into spring. And all right, that might not kind of come across on the screen, but just the kind of the pictures of them racing along the sea, alongside the sea, and going over the bugs. I mean, the last 2 hours, I just loved it. I mean, people say, "Oh, nothing's happening," but it just builds and builds and builds all the time.
Judge Sophie can decide on this. Right then, one of them is going to be a monument going forward. Is it San Remo or is it Strada Bianchi?
I'm with Pete here at San Remo.
Oh!
Yeah. I agree with everything Jez and yourself have said about Strada. It is beautiful, but San Remo for me is, the sprinters can still be in the mix, and the first part of it is a bit, okay, we can crack on with this, but the last bit is phenomenal racing, phenomenal television, and I don't think for me to be that one, just because it's more of a lottery as well.
Is it a lottery, San Remo?
Yeah, it could be a lottery. There's been a lot of surprise winners there.
Jasper Stuyven won it this year. I mean, nobody would have picked Jasper Stuyven as the winner of it this year. Whereas if you looked at Strada Bianchi, you'd kind of thought, all right, you might not have expected Egan Bernal to be up there, but Van der Poel and Alaphilippe, you thought, well, they'll be nailed on for the podium.
True. Well, Sophie, let's hear your 3 moments of the year and the one that you think is the one that stand out.
As I mentioned before, for me, it was Pogačar at the Tour, just because of in a racing perspective, how he tackled it. He wasn't caught up in any of the crashes, which was really overlooked at the time. I think everyone just said, it was luck with this, but given that pretty much all of his other rivals did crash and were affected, I think his ability to stay out of that said something about his awareness. And also his winner's speech for me, he was asked at the very end to name his two highlights from the race. And, he's a young kid who's got the world at his feet. He's smashed the Tour de France. And one of those, he actually mentioned Alan Piper, who is an Australian sports director at the team, very ill with cancer. And I just thought for him and Piper made it the penultimate time trial, just to be there. He hadn't been at the Tour because he was ill. So I think for Pogačar to mention him in that when he could have said his stage wins or his success or whatever the multitude of things he did at the Tour was pretty classy. I then had Fabio Jakobsen and Dylan Groenewegen joining winner's circle at the Tour of Wallonia. I didn't watch that race, but I noted that they were back in the winner's circle after that horrible accident in Poland, which the year before, which I thought had the capacity to break both of them mentally and physically. I mean, I loved that Roubaix returned, but I would also say the Women's Olympic Game road race. For me, that was just a good story. I know my editors in Australia especially were very interested in that. You had Annemiek van Vleuten, who thought she'd won for celebrating, and then the woman that actually did wasn't even really a cyclist. She was a mathematician by trade. So that for me was a good story too.
So if you're going to choose one of those, which for you was the highlight?
I'd probably have to say Pogačar at the Tour, even though that is very obvious. I do like to look for the smaller stories in the bigger stories, but I don't see him being unseated at the Tour for a while unless, he's a young guy. He comes from a good family. I don't think he's dealt with being smacked around by proper adulthood yet. So how long he can continue that, I'm not sure. But I think you could definitely say after that he's the new superpower at the Tour.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with Pogačar is, we've seen it. Rod Illingworth was talking about Ineos's year and what they're going to do next year, and they're talking about ripping up their rule book, basically, what they're going to do because of Pogačar, Pogačar, however you want to say his name. So I think maybe he's going to warp how people race around him. And if that means people race more dynamically and more excitingly, it can only be good for cycling. I actually do think that. Pete, let's get your top 3 moments of the year and the one that you think is the one that stands out of those 3.
Okay, well, I'm going to... 2 of mine are De Koning Quick Step sprinters. The first one is Fabio Jakobsen. coming, I think he was 85th in a sprint on a third day of the Criterium du Dauphiné, which sounds pretty awful, but it was actually the first time he kind of put himself forward for a sprint since his crash with Groenewegen last year, and it was a bit of a schlep up to the line, which Sonny Colbrelli won. But I just remember him coming across the line that day, and God, his face was just full of joy, and everybody shared it with him. I mean, can't ever remember a rider coming in 85th and everybody being pleased for him. I mean, it was just absolutely astonishing. Second one, Mark Cavendish, because everybody loves a comeback story, and his comeback story was absolutely sensational. Really, I mean, he didn't even know he was going to be riding the Tour until about 10 days before it, or maybe even less than that. And then to come back and win 4 stages was just astounding. I know a lot of people have said like the opposition wasn't the greatest, but I mean, you can say that about Tadej Pogačar winning the yellow jersey. The opposition wasn't the greatest for him either, and nobody takes anything away from what he did. I don't think we should do that from Cavendish either. And the last one was just kind of quite a personal one on the last big mountain day on the Tour that went to Luzardiden, where we saw Pogačar, Vingegaard, and Carapaz fighting out for the stage win. I just went down and stood in the crowd by the barriers and watched the whole bunch go by. They kind of didn't really have anything on that day. And that was just a real highlight for me. I mean, it just felt like the Tour was back to normal. Luzardiden is one of the places I really love to see racing, because it's such a beautiful climb. And I don't know, I just felt really moved by the whole experience. It just made me happy, I guess. And that's ultimately what being a cycling fan's all about.
I love the idea of that last one, because I remember watching that stage, and it was the first time I think I'd watched the first stage I've watched of this year's Tour, that I watched it and thought, do you know what? Pogačar isn't indefeatable, you know, like, because I think Carapaz tried to do the sneaky on them. Vingegaard put a couple of attacks in. It was a wonderful bit of jousting bike racing to watch. I mean, they all pretty much, you know, finished together in the end. There was no real move on GC because of it. But Jeremy, it was as what Pete just said. It was great to watch. I mean, I watched it on TV. I wasn't in the crowd. I would love to have been.
I remember the Sunday when we arrived in Paris, parked up, and we were staying in different parts of the centre of Paris, so I had to walk down the Champs-Élysées from my hotel to the press room, and which was kind of a kilometre or so, and it was the most beautiful afternoon, and the French national flag was flying, and there's a bit of U2 wafting through the afternoon air, and there were loads of people on the barriers who'd arrived, you know, with their flags, national flags, to waiting for the race, and I just found it really moving, because I was kind of, life was back to kind of normal. There were people walking around, sitting at the cafes off the Champs-Élysées, and I just felt really kind of, as I say, probably a bit of fatigue and just, you know, the end of the Tour. But I just found it really moving, and I started to think, well, we've all been through this incredible experience of the pandemic. You know, people have lost loved ones. We've been shut away from each other, and now this is a coming back together. And the Tour suddenly represented something more than just a bike race. You know, it meant a lot more than just a bike race. And I thought of all the years I've been there, and I've kind of just been, races over, you know, I can go home now kind of thing. And I didn't feel like that. I almost felt like I should actually stay here all afternoon and just watch and soak it all up. And then I think you messaged me and said, where's that recording? And ruined the whole mood. So thanks, OJ.
Of which I think you replied with a quite fruity swear word, Jeremy.
I think it was quite a withering response, yes.
It was indeed.
Anyway, you're all crying now, aren't you? You're all moved.
I was close to tears, and you were crying in
tell.
Paris, but at the time I didn't realise it was tears of romance, more tears of frustration.
Yeah.
So I tell you what, then let's look at the 2 Tour announcements that came out. We've got the men's Tour in 2022. Now, I have managed to, Jeremy, completely avoid really any of the chat about it. And I've done it for 2 reasons. One, because I wanted to engage with it as you explained it to me. As somebody who hasn't seen any of the announcements was the first reason. The second one is I've just been really busy and a bit lazy. So, talk to me then. What is the 22 Tour route like? I've seen bits of it.
Okay, so the men's Tour de France has the furthest ever Grand Départ from Paris. That's correct, isn't it, Pete?
Most northerly, yeah. I guess it is probably the furthest, yeah.
I think Prudhomme said it was the furthest from Paris. So
It must be, yeah.
it starts in Copenhagen in Denmark, for those who don't know, which is 900 kilometers from the first French stage, and then a very long transfer to northern France. Then we go across northern France. We have some cobbles to Arenberg. We don't go through the forest of Arenberg itself, but we've got a cobble stretch. It traces its way down, and then the first mountain finishes at Super Planche des Belles Filles, which is now called Super Planche des Belles Filles, not just Planche des Belles Filles. And that's because the gravel section, which I think now is obviously going to become a fixture on the Tour de France, at the top of that climb, entitles it to be called Super. Is that right? That it's just now called Super because of that? Because it's got the gravel. And the good thing about
it's above Planche des Belles Filles.
Okay, yeah. So, but it was called Planche des Belles Filles, wasn't it, before? But now it's Super.
Yeah, but I think that's the resort where it finishes. But Super's, I don't know, it comes from the Latin, so it just means above. So I guess it's above Planche des Belles Filles.
Oh, I never thought we'd do this podcast and have Latin in it, but thank you, Pete, for that, for taking us up market.
But the interesting thing about that is that the women's tour, which we'll get onto in a minute, which Sophie can take us through. The women's tour route actually finishes there as well. So I think that's quite nice that they've done that in a way that they've got two summit finishes where, later on in early August, we'll be able to compare the men's and the women's race on those summits. Then we go down basically the Jura Mountains into the Alps, and the biggest stage there is two big stages there. The Col du Granon, which was last used in 1986, when Greg LeMond was either assisted to victory by Bernard Hinault or avoided being stabbed in the back by Bernard Hinault, according to which side of the fence you're sitting on. I know which side I'm on. And
which side is that, Jeremy?
Which is the side of the American kid. So we got the Col du Granon. Is it the highest point of the tour? It's not, is it? Because the Galibier is the highest point. That's right, isn't it?
Peter. It's the highest finish.
Yeah, I'm a big fan, Jeremy, of how you're using Pete here as your stato.
Yes, that's right. Stato Cossins. But no, I defer to him because he's written, books about all these climbs, so I don't want to get it wrong. And then we go from Briançon, which is just below the Col du Granon. I would say the Col du Granon, I've ridden it a long time ago, and it is horrible. It's very exposed. If it's hot, you just get fried. Very steep, and it's a really nasty surface. And it's kind of at the end of that stage, which includes some of the other biggest climbs in the region around Briançon, the Telegraphe Galibier, all those famous climbs are on that stage. It's a really nasty finish. And then the next day they go from Briançon to Alpe d'Huez, the return of Alpe d'Huez, which is long awaited.
Which Pete and I, for in one of my previous jobs working for the corporation, we rode it together, didn't we, Pete? And we filmed the whole thing on it.
We did, yeah. I don't think we were together for too long because I seem to remember you dropped me pretty quickly. But
I got very overexcited about doing it.
It was incredibly hot. I remember it was like 40 degrees when we did it.
Yeah, my tyres got so hot they exploded when I was coming down it, which was slightly scary. I almost crashed a couple of times. Just a quick question on outdoors before you carry on, Jeremy. Pete, have they taken Armstrong's name off all of the corners now? Is he gone?
I don't think so. No, I think he's still there. They'd have to move them all about if they took his name off. I mean, obviously they've crossed his name out of the race's Palmares, but I think he's still on them.
Just for people who don't then, just talk us through the history of what the corners, because there's a signpost on each of the corners of the 21, 22 corners?
There's 21 bends where they've got signposts on them, 21 hairpins. Yeah, and they've each winner on Alpe d'Huez has their name on a hairpin, and they've now reached a stage, I think, I can't remember how many times, it's into the 30s now that they've been up there. So some of the corners have two names on them. And obviously he won there in 2004 and 2001, I think. So he had kind of consecutive corners, and I think I think his name's still up there. Somebody's probably defaced it though.
No names. So then we go from Alpe d'Huez, we go to the village at the bottom, Bourg d'Oison, and then we've got really three, I'd say, lumpy transitional stages, which could be really tricky. And again, if they're very, very hot, could be stages that kind of upset the apple cart in the race, particularly the one first we go from Bourg d'Oison to Saint-Étienne, which is a classic Tour de France transition town. The next day starts in Saint Etienne to Mende and goes up to the Aérogramme above Mende, which the Monte Laurent-Jalabert, which is this very short but steep climb, and that could potentially throw a few eggs out of the basket, so to speak. And then you go down to Carcassonne the next day, and then into the Pyrenees. And Pete, I think you should take us through from Carcassonne through to those triptych of Pyrenean stages.
Yeah, so the first one is into Foix, which is about 6 kilometers from where I'm sitting now, which is very nice. It comes through my village. They go over the Porte de l'Air, and then they come up the Mur de Péguerre, which is kind of the nearest col to where I am. But they come at the far side of it, up this 3 kilometer climb, which averages 12%. It's absolutely, when I try and avoid it whenever I can, which is every time I go out riding, basically. The last one is to Hautacam, which they've not been to for a while, and I love Hautacam. It's a beautiful climb, and then they approach it via this really tricky climb, the Col de Spandel, which has never been in the Tour before. And again, I've heard it's, I almost use the B word there. It's extremely hard. It's very, very hard indeed. And then they go up to Hautacam.
But anyway, after they exit the Pyrenees, we've got a Friday transitional stage before Paris to Cahors, and then a potential final time trial, which could be a potential kind of a decider. Well, it will be the decider if there's any tension left in the race between La Capelle, Marival and Rocamadour. And then we have a very long transfer to Paris. And that's the 2022 Tour de France, men's Tour de France. But obviously, there's then immediately on the Sunday that the men's tour arrives in Paris, which is logistically quite complicated. Shortly before the men's race arrives in Paris, the women's Tour de France starts in Paris. So, Sophie, I don't know if you could explain how that's going to work.
No, I had reservations. I'm speaking more generally at the moment as opposed to the actual race route, which I think is great. Like the men's, it incorporates a bit of everything, a bit of terrain that would suit every rider. And I think if you're for the first women's Tour de France, that's what you want. You want to be able to showcase the strength of all of the riders in the peloton. And it's amazing that they've appointed a female race director as well. So I think you'll properly see it through the eyes of women's racing, so to speak. I had reservations about a women's tour, which we talked about earlier this year, and how they were going to run it, because I wasn't sure if after doing a full Tour de France that you're going to get the same sort of leverage, that you need, not leverage, but broadcast rights to effectively now it becomes like a 6-week or a 7-week race assignment. And yeah, also just how they were going to coordinate that. But I do like that it's starting in Paris for that reason, for the symbolism of it, and also because everyone will be there. But Pete, I know you summarised the actual course on Twitter the other day, and it was beautiful as to where they go. I know there's a bit through the Champagne region, which I certainly won't be missing that. But no, I'm really looking forward to it, and I do think it has a bit of everything, including finishing at La Planche de Belleville.
Yeah, I mean it is a good race. I mean, I saw people on Twitter were saying, because it goes just due east from Paris into the Vosges region, and there were people saying, oh, there's no Alpe d'Huez, there's no Mont Ventoux. I mean, it's. You probably ask most of the women racers, and they probably say, well, we don't race up climbs of that length at the moment. It'd just be a complete one-off. I mean, we're not saying they're not ready for it, but it's not something that's kind of within the scope of what all the teams are doing at the moment. And so the Vosges is obviously kind of more medium mountain, but it's still tough. And so they have this stage or 2 or 3 stages approaching the Vosges, which are really interesting, really undulating. One has got long sections of gravel road through the Champagne vineyards, and I'm sure that's going to be spectacular. Then they get into the Vosges themselves. There's a very difficult stage on the Saturday that finishes on the top of the Markstein climb, kind of in the centre of the Vosges mountains, that goes over 3 cols beforehand. And then you've got this super finish on Super Planche de Belleville on the last day. I guess it's going to decide the race. And it's just interesting seeing some of the feedback from the women about the race, and pretty much unanimous. They're all saying, look, this is exactly what we want. It's a very open race. There's lots of opportunities for everybody. Anybody can win this. And I guess, I mean, Anna van der Breggen and one or two other riders have stepped away this year. Anna van Vleuten will be there. She'll be one of the favourites. Demi Vollering, I know, likes the course a lot. So I don't know. I mean, I just thought they did a really good job with it. Marianne Roos is in charge here. She's a race director. I think it's going to be great. I can't wait for it.
I know. I think it's going to be wonderful, and I look forward to the race. And I think it is interesting what you were saying there, Pete, because you read you interact with a lot of this stuff when announcements are made via Twitter, and there was a lot of quite vocal. It seemed to be men at the time saying, "Oh, I can't believe they're not letting the women ride the same sort of distances that men are doing. This is unfair." And then you would actually look at what the women were saying and say, "No, these are the distances that we ride. It's the distances we want to ride, and this course looks pretty great."
First thing is, it's not a bolt-on to the men's race, which is a great point in its favour, and that was something that I think a lot of people were always fearful that they kind of try and run it on the same day. It's a standalone race in its own right, and it's coming after the men's race. There's even a chance. I mean, there's even a chance that a week-long race could be more exciting than a 3-week race. That's happened lots of times before, and I think you look at the terrain, and there are lots of opportunities there. It's not so arduous that you're going to get some ridiculous time gaps on a mountain stage in the middle of the race. I think also logistically they were caught between a rock and a hard place, because you can imagine if everybody gets to Paris and it's the same helicopter pilots, it's the same car drivers, it's the same journalists, and they say, okay, we're all going back to the Pyrenees, the Alps. They have to marry all these considerations, the logistic considerations, the sponsorship considerations, the TV considerations, to make this thing fly. And I think what they've done for year one is fine. I mean, I'd like to see it go maybe through the Alps, and I'm sure it will. But I think for the first year, it's really good.
It's great. It's great it's happening. The Tour de France Femmes avec Zwift is going to be amazing. Sorry, Sophie.
Well, I was also going to say, just on that, you have to consider that the women's calendar is pretty much entirely different to the men's calendar. So you never going to have, they haven't had a women's Tour de France for ages, because the biggest event on their calendar was the Giro, which conflicted time-wise. So I agree. I think what they've come up with, particularly considering that they're working with a different time frame, is great. And I'll be interested to see how it fits in the women's program in general, and if we see different dynamics in racing or a changing of the guard even in the women's peloton as well.
I mean, there's one final point I'd like to make about that, which is made really well on Twitter by somebody's Twitter handle. I can't remember, but anyway, I did like it. I did like the tweet, but which was that basically, why are they obliged to replicate what men do? And I think that's a really good point.
Is a very, very good point. It is a very, very good point, which is not the point of women's sport at all, is it? The women's sport is there to be women's sport and to do what women's sports does. Right, we'll focus more on the route of both of those incoming podcasts, which I believe will be in 2022. Now, though, let's talk Dave Brailsford and the Ineos Grenadiers. I mean, they are one of the super teams. They're the best funded team out there. And Jeremy, you had a chance to chat to Dave Brailsford, didn't you?
Yeah, I spoke to him as the tour ended, and I revisited this interview the other day because I thought, I was reading all the stuff about the revolving door, which seems to be going on at Ineos at the moment, with Rod Ellingworth arriving, Tim Kerrison, their long-term coach, big ally of Chris Froome, leaving. The kind of athletic mastermind behind, portrayed as the athletic mastermind behind so much of their success. He's moving on. Gianni Moscon, the infamous Gianni Moscon, is moving on as well. So there's lots of change there. And when I caught up with Dave Brailsford at the end of the tour, there was just one little section of this interview where he was talking about kind of, the churn within the sport, and also the churn of talent within the sport, and also how Ineos Grenadiers, as a team in transition, could ever hope to overcome the prodigious Tadej Pogačar. How are you going to cope with this kid? I mean, he looks unstoppable. Everybody's kind of racing based, everybody feels like everybody's racing based on what he's doing. Are you a team in transition waiting for your next young talent to come through, or with Egan and Richard, is that the next wave for you?
Well, I think in sport over the years, in all sports really, whenever somebody comes along and you get a new kind of force and you think, how's this person going to be beaten? It happens quite often when you look around, and I think there's nothing. If you're going to get the best out of yourself, you need a fierce competitor. and that's what we got. And we've got to go and figure out now how we can what we can do, how we come back and challenge, which I'm sure we can. It's just a matter of figuring it out. You don't just drop your shoulder and think, well, what can we do? That's not how sport works. You go, right, how are we going to beat this guy? Well, I might have to find new ways, new approaches, new tactics, new ways of training, just different. But that's the whole challenge, and I think that you embrace it. And when something looks invincible, like this time last year, Jumbo looked invincible until the last day, and it didn't quite work for them. And they haven't looked invincible this year. It's a totally different race this year, to be fair. And so you just never know, and you got to figure out how to do it. And for sure, there's this newer, younger generation coming through. But I really do think if Geraint hadn't crashed, I think if the other guys hadn't had those early kind of mishaps, and Roglic was still in the race, I think we'd have seen a very different race. I really do. So.
Are you happy? I mean, the impression we've got in the press room, and I'm sharing this with you because you probably know anyway. I don't know how much you read, but is that the team isn't as cohesive, isn't as kind of iron-willed, iron-fisted as it was, say, 3 or 4 years ago. Is that because you've had a lot of change, haven't you? And you've lost key people. I mean, you lost a DS who was much loved, brilliant in his job.
Nico had an impact for sure.
Yeah, and then you've lost a talismanic leader who had a terrible accident and is now, carrying on with his career elsewhere. Were those characters, it's like a band. They say great bands, they just come together and they create great music. And then somebody leaves and it all goes to shit. I mean, I'm not saying that's what's happened here, but do you think, is there an element of the right people at the right time as well? Just happy accidents of people, or...?
I don't think when you run the tour with 4 different riders, and we've done, I think this was the 34th Grand Tour, 1 12. I don't think that's an accident, if I'm honest. And I don't think that's a band. We've done it with a lot of different people, and we've won the Giro this year with Ego. There's been 2 Grand Tours this year. We finished 1st and 3rd in both of them, and we still got the 3rd one to go. And I'd like to think we're going to have a good crack at that. So whatever other people are seeing, I'm not maybe seeing it in the same way.
No.
So for sure, teams transition and riders leave, to get older, come to the end of their careers, and you've got a new generation coming through. But when I look at that new generation, and I look at the younger guys in the team, I look at Richard Carapaz, and I look at the likes of Tom Pidcock, who just bounced onto the scene this year with his performance in the early season. I think, I feel very optimistic about it, if I'm honest.
So there you go. That is Dave Brailsford Sir Dave Brailsford talking to Jeremy in the summer.
But an interesting follow-up to that interview, OJ, is that at no point during that discussion, that conversation, was there any discussion of kind of like whether Ineos would ever move in to make a bid for Pogačar or to lure him away from UAE Emirates, where he rides at the moment. But it's been reported in the last couple of days that by an Italian journalist, Beppe Conti, that Ineos offered Pogačar 3 times his actual UAE wage, supposedly €6 million a year, so 18 million euros a year, would you believe? But apparently Pogačar refused the deal. That's what's being reported on Rai Sport in Italy. Having said that, I've contacted Ineos Grenadiers and I've been told that there's been no conversations between them and Tadej Pogačar's people whatsoever. So for the moment, at least, it's a non-story. But I guess, would they break the bank that can completely smash the salary structure in cycling to secure this guy if they can't beat him? It's an interesting point.
It is a fascinating way to end this final podcast of 2021. So, thank you so much. There's plenty more great content over at lecourseontete.com, where you can also order our forthcoming review of the year, Racing in the Time of the Super Teams, which features all of our contributors throughout 2021. And that's about it. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you to Jeremy Whittle, as always. Thank you, Jeremy.
Cheers, OJ.
Thank you to Peter as well, who joined us so abruptly but beautifully. I thought the way you joined us was almost, you look like one of those sprinters, maybe a Mark Cavendish who has no lead out around him and just shoehorns himself into what's going on.
Bonsoir, OJ.
I felt like he kind of burst through the studio wall.
He did, almost, didn't he? Like what's the American thing they have? The juice thing and the jug.
It suddenly appears out of nowhere.
Thank you to Sophie Smith as well, who is out of lockdown now.
Out of the world's longest lockdown, with an asterisk, because we can just stay out after 9 p.m. now, and you can sit outside at a pub. Retail isn't fully open yet; that'll be next month. But yes, there is a sense of light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, so thank you to Jeremy, to Peter and to Sophie. Thank you for listening throughout 2021. We'll be back, of course, with insight, comment and analysis from the European racing scene. Until then, adios, ciao, a biento. Paolo, once more with feeling.
Via, via, vieni via di qui. Niente più ti lega a questi luoghi, neanche questi fiori azzurri.